I was 26 when I moved into my studio apartment in Seattle. It was November 2023, the kind of cold, wet season that makes you appreciate having your own space. The building was older, built in the 1970s with thick walls and creaky floors. My unit was on the 3rd floor, overlooking a narrow alley and the brick wall of the building next door. The landlord mentioned the apartment had sat empty for 8 months before I moved in. Something about the previous tenant leaving suddenly, breaking their lease without explanation. I didn't ask questions. The rent was reasonable, and I needed a place quickly after my breakup. I work remotely as a data analyst, which means I spend most days alone, staring at spreadsheets and listening to ambient music. The isolation never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. No roommates, no unexpected visitors, just me and my routines. 2 weeks after moving in, I installed a simple security camera system. Nothing fancy, just a doorbell camera and one inside my apartment pointing at the front door. I'd had packages stolen at my previous place, and I wanted to prevent that from happening again. The setup took an hour, and by evening, everything was running smoothly. The first month was completely normal. I checked the app occasionally, see delivery drivers dropping packages, neighbors passing in the hallway, nothing worth noting. I fell into a comfortable rhythm. Work, gym, groceries, sleep. The apartment felt safe, quiet, mine. Then December arrived, and with it came the first strange alert. It was December 8th, a Friday night around 11:30 p.m. I was already in bed, scrolling through my phone, when the notification buzzed. Interior camera motion detected. I frowned. The camera faced my front door from inside the apartment, and I hadn't moved from my bedroom in over an hour. I opened the app and watched the live feed. My living room was dark except for the soft glow from the streetlight outside filtering through the curtains. Everything looked normal at first. Then I saw it. A shadow crossed the wall near my bookshelf, slow and deliberate, like someone walking past. My blood ran cold. I was alone in the apartment. I'd locked the door hours ago. I muted the sound on my phone and listened. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. No footsteps. No creaking floorboards. Nothing. I forced myself to get out of bed and walk to the living room. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to run. When I turned on the lights, the room was empty. Nothing out of place. No signs anyone had been there. I checked the door. Still locked. Windows. Still latched. I went back to my phone and rewound the footage. At 11:28 p.m., the shadow had crossed from left to right, moving from the direction of my closet toward the kitchen. But when I zoomed in, I couldn't see any person. Just the shadow itself moving independently across the wall. I tried to rationalize it. A trick of light. Car headlights from the street below. Something outside casting shadows through the window. But the explanation felt hollow. The shadow had moved too deliberately, too smoothly, like it had purpose. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the building made me jump. The heater clicking on. Pipes groaning. Footsteps from the apartment above. By morning, exhaustion dulled my fear into something manageable. I convinced myself I'd imagined it or misunderstood what I'd seen. 3 days later, it happened again. December 11th, Monday night, 2:47 a.m. Interior camera motion detected. I was awake this time, lying in bed, unable to sleep after a stressful work deadline. I opened the app immediately. The shadow was back. But this time, it wasn't just crossing the wall. It was standing still near my front door, perfectly upright, shaped like a person but without any defining features. No head, no limbs, just a dark silhouette pressed against the wall like someone was shining a flashlight from behind them. I watched, paralyzed, as the shadow began to move. It slid along the wall toward my bedroom door, slow and steady, like it was searching. My bedroom door was partially open, and I could see the faint outline of the hallway beyond. I held my breath. The shadow stopped just outside my bedroom. Then it tilted, as if the person casting it had leaned forward to look inside. But there was no person, just the shadow. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering my address and situation. The dispatcher told me to stay locked in my room and that officers were on their way. I pressed my back against the headboard, eyes locked on the door, waiting for something to push through. Nothing came. The shadow remained in the hallway for exactly 7 minutes, then slid back toward the living room and disappeared. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they searched every inch of my apartment. No one was there. No signs of forced entry. No logical explanation. One officer suggested it might be a reflection from the building across the alley. But when I showed him the footage, he went quiet. The shadow had moved independently of any external light source. It had paused. It had leaned. It had watched. After the police left, I couldn't stay in the apartment. I packed a bag and went to a friend's place for the night, telling her I needed a change of scenery. I didn't mention the shadow. I didn't want her to think I was losing my mind. The next day, I returned to my apartment during daylight hours. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust particles floating in the air. I checked the camera footage from the previous night. Nothing after the police left. No shadows. No movement. I decided to research the building's history. It took hours of digging through city records and old newspaper archives. But eventually, I found something. In 1984, a woman had died in my unit. The details were sparse, but the report mentioned she'd lived alone and had been found by the landlord after neighbors complained about a smell. No foul play suspected. Natural causes, they'd concluded. The article included a grainy photo of her. She was young, maybe in her 30s, with dark hair and a distant expression. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to reconcile this woman with the shadow I'd seen. But shadows don't have faces. They don't have histories. They're just absences of light. That night, I forced myself to stay in the apartment. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't being driven out by fear. I left all the lights on, positioned myself on the couch with a view of the entire living room, and kept my phone in my hand, camera app open and ready. At 11:53 p.m., the shadow returned. This time, it appeared near the window, pressed against the glass like someone was standing outside on the fire escape. But I was on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape on my side of the building. I watched as the shadow moved across the window, then slid down the wall toward the floor, defying every law of physics. It pooled at the base of the wall for a moment, then began to spread across the floor like liquid. I pulled my feet onto the couch, heart hammering. The shadow stretched toward me, slow and deliberate, covering more ground with each passing second. I ran to my bedroom and slammed the door, pushing my dresser against it. My phone buzzed. Interior camera motion detected. I opened the app with shaking hands and saw the shadow flowing under my bedroom door, seeping through the gap like smoke. I climbed onto my bed and pressed myself into the corner. The shadow pooled at the foot of my bed, then began to rise, forming that same upright silhouette I'd seen before. It stood there, facing me, completely still. Then it moved closer. 1 step, 2 steps, 3, until it was standing right beside my bed. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It leaned down, and for the first time, I felt something. Not touch exactly, but presence. Cold, overwhelming presence. My phone screen went black. The camera feed had cut out. The lights in my bedroom flickered once, twice, then died completely. In the darkness, I heard something I'll never forget. A whisper. Not words exactly, but the shape of words. The feeling of someone trying to speak but lacking the voice to do so. The lights came back on. The shadow was gone. My phone screen showed the camera feed again, but it was corrupted, filled with static and glitching fragments. I grabbed my keys and left immediately, not bothering to pack anything. I stayed at a hotel for a week. During that time, I contacted the landlord and broke my lease, paying whatever penalties necessary. She didn't argue. She didn't seem surprised. Before I moved out completely, I went back one last time during the day to collect my things. As I was packing, I noticed something I'd never seen before. On the wall near my closet, barely visible in certain light, were faint marks. Scratches, dozens of them, clustered together like someone had been clawing at the wall from the inside. I touched them and they felt cold. Not temperature cold, but the absence of warmth. I pulled my hand back and finished packing as quickly as possible. On my way out, the landlord stopped me in the lobby. She handed me a folder. Inside was a document, a police report from 1984. It included details the newspaper article hadn't mentioned. The woman who died in my unit had called 911 17 times in the weeks before her death. Each time, she reported seeing someone in her apartment. Someone who appeared as shadows on the walls. Someone who moved when they shouldn't have been able to move. Each time, police found nothing. The final call came at 2:43 a.m. on November 14th, 1984. She told the dispatcher that the shadows weren't reflections anymore. They were solid. They were touching her. The dispatcher sent officers, but by the time they arrived, she was already gone. Heart failure, the coroner determined. No external injuries. No signs of struggle. But the report included one detail that made my stomach drop. In her apartment, every single wall was covered in scratch marks. Hundreds of them. Deep gouges in the drywall, like someone had been desperately trying to claw their way through to the other side. I left the building that day and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still get notifications on my phone. Interior camera motion detected. Even though I removed the cameras months ago. Even though I'm living across the city now. The alerts come through like clockwork, always between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. I stopped opening them after the first few times. The feed always shows the same thing. My old apartment, empty and dark, with a shadow standing in the center of the room, watching, waiting, and every time the shadow is a little closer to the camera than it was before. I moved into the duplex in Portland during late spring 2024, right when the cherry blossoms were falling and coating everything in pale pink petals. The place was perfect for my needs. Affordable, quiet, close to the transit line. My side of the duplex was freshly renovated, with new appliances and clean white walls that smelled faintly of paint. My neighbor on the other side was a man named Peter. The landlord mentioned him briefly during the walkthrough, saying he'd lived there for 7 years and kept to himself. That suited me fine. I valued my privacy and wasn't looking to make friends. The first time I saw Peter was 3 days after moving in. I was bringing groceries from my car when he emerged from his front door. He was tall, maybe in his late 50s, with graying hair and a thin frame. He glanced at me, gave a small nod, and walked to his car without a word. That was it. No introduction. No welcome to the neighborhood. Just acknowledgement and departure. Over the following weeks, I established a routine. Work from home as a freelance translator. Morning runs through the nearby park. Evening cooking sessions where I'd blast music and dance around my kitchen. The walls between our units were surprisingly thick. I never heard Peter, and I assumed he never heard me. But I noticed patterns. Peter left his house every morning at exactly 6:47 a.m., returned at 3:22 p.m., and left again at 7:15 p.m. for what I assumed was an evening activity. His schedule never varied. Not once. Even on weekends, he maintained the same precise timing. Sometimes I'd see him through my window, getting into his car or retrieving his mail. He never looked at my side of the duplex, never waved, never smiled. Just mechanical movements like a wind-up toy following its programming. By July, I'd grown comfortable with the arrangement. Peter was the perfect neighbor. Invisible, quiet, predictable. I didn't need more than that. But then something shifted. It started with sounds. Small things I initially dismissed. A faint tapping on the shared wall between our units, always at night, always around 11 p.m. Top, top, top. 3 knocks, then silence. Then 3 more knocks an hour later. I assumed he was hanging pictures or doing minor repairs. After a week of nightly tapping, I decided to mention it. I caught him one morning as he was leaving for work. I called out a friendly greeting and mentioned the noise, keeping my tone light and non-accusatory. He stopped, turned slowly, and looked at me for a long moment. His expression was completely neutral, unreadable. Then he walked to his car without saying a word. No acknowledgement, no apology, no explanation. Just silence. The tapping continued that night, and the next, and the next. But now it was louder, more insistent. Top, top, top. Top, top, top. Always in sets of 3. Always at 11 p.m. and midnight and 1 a.m. I started wearing headphones to bed, blasting white noise to drown out the sound. It worked for a few nights, but then the pattern changed. The tapping moved. It traveled along the wall, starting near the floor and rising up toward the ceiling, like someone was dragging something metallic along the surface. One night, frustrated and sleep-deprived, I got out of bed and knocked back. 3 times. Hard. The sound on the other side stopped immediately. For a full minute, there was complete silence. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving through Peter's side of the duplex. They approached the shared wall and stopped directly opposite where I was standing. I pressed my ear against the wall and listened. Nothing. Just silence and the faint hum of his refrigerator. Then, so quiet I almost missed it, I heard breathing. Deep, steady breaths like someone standing perfectly still, waiting. I stepped back from the wall, unnerved. The breathing continued for another minute. Then the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I contacted the landlord and complained about the noise. She promised to speak with Peter and asked if I'd considered confronting him directly. I explained I'd already tried. She sighed and said she'd handle it. 2 days passed with no noise. No tapping. No footsteps. I thought the issue was resolved. But on the third night, something worse happened. I woke at 2:37 a.m. to the sound of my doorknob rattling. Not forcefully, just a gentle turning, back and forth, like someone was testing whether it was locked. I froze in bed, listening. The rattling stopped. Then I heard footsteps on my front porch, slow and measured, moving from one end to the other. I grabbed my phone and opened the security camera app I'd installed on my front door. The feed loaded, showing my empty porch illuminated by the motion sensor light. Nobody was there, but I could still hear the footsteps, clear as day, pacing back and forth. I watched the live feed for 5 full minutes. The footsteps continued, but the camera showed nothing. No person. No shadow. No movement. Just my empty porch and the sound of someone walking across it. When the footsteps finally stopped, I heard my doorknob rattle again. Once, twice, then silence. The next day, I reviewed the footage. The camera had recorded everything, the motion light triggering, the timestamp, the angle of the porch. But there was no visual evidence of anyone being there. No glitches. No corruption. Just empty footage paired with sounds that shouldn't exist. I decided to set up a second camera, this one pointing at Peter's front door. If he was the one coming to my porch at night, I'd have proof. The installation took 20 minutes, and by evening, both cameras were running simultaneously. That night at 2:37 a.m., my phone buzzed. Front door motion detected. I opened the app and switched between both camera feeds. My porch was empty, but Peter's camera showed his front door opening slowly. He stepped out, dressed in dark clothing, and stood on his porch for a long moment, facing my side of the duplex. Then he walked down his steps and disappeared from frame. I switched to my porch camera. Nothing. No Peter. No movement. Just the sound of footsteps starting up again, pacing back and forth. I jumped out of bed and looked through my bedroom window, which faced the front yard. Peter was standing on his porch again, completely still, staring directly at my window. We made eye contact. He didn't blink, didn't react, just stared. I ducked away from the window, heart racing. When I checked the cameras again, he was gone. Both feeds showed empty porches, but the footsteps on my porch continued for another 10 minutes before finally stopping. I called the police the next morning and filed a report. They took my statement, reviewed the footage, and agreed it was strange but not technically criminal. No threats had been made. No property had been damaged. They said they'd do a welfare check on Peter and advised me to keep documenting everything. The officer who did the welfare check called me later that afternoon. He said Peter had been cooperative, denied ever going to my porch, and claimed he'd been asleep at the time in question. The officer had no grounds to pursue it further but suggested I consider a restraining order if the behavior continued. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, watching both camera feeds on my phone, waiting for something to happen. At 11 p.m., the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't on the wall. It was on my front door. Top, top, top. Pause. Top, top, top. I checked the camera feed. Nobody was there, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and persistent. I grabbed my car keys, intending to leave and spend the night somewhere else. But when I approached my front door, the tapping stopped. I looked through the peephole. Peter was standing on my porch, inches from the door, staring directly at the peephole. His face was expressionless. His eyes were wide, unblinking. I backed away slowly, my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. He stood there for 3 full minutes. Then he turned and walked back to his side of the duplex. I heard his door open and close. I packed a bag immediately and left through my back door, circling around to my car. I stayed at a hotel that night and called the landlord in the morning, demanding to break my lease. She was sympathetic but explained I'd lose my deposit and would be responsible for finding a new tenant. I didn't care. I told her I'd pay whatever was necessary. She said she'd start the process. While I was packing my things over the next few days, always during daylight hours, I found something disturbing. In my hallway closet, tucked behind some boxes, was a small hole drilled through the shared wall. It was barely noticeable, hidden behind a jacket I rarely wore. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it through the hole. On the other side, I could see directly into Peter's living room. His furniture was arranged to face the shared wall, and mounted on a tripod pointing directly at the hole was a video camera. The red recording light was on. I felt sick. I grabbed my phone and took photos of everything, then left immediately. I sent the photos to the police and filed another report. They obtained a warrant and searched Peter's side of the duplex. What they found was worse than I'd imagined. Hours of footage, not just of my wall, but of me. Somehow, he'd installed a network of tiny cameras in my unit, hidden in vents and light fixtures and behind outlet covers. He'd been watching me for months, recording everything. Peter was arrested. The charges included stalking, voyeurism, and unlawful surveillance. During the investigation, police found journals, pages and pages of notes about my routines, my habits, my schedule. He'd been documenting everything, planning something I'll never fully understand. In one entry, dated 3 days before I'd moved in, he'd written, "She'll be perfect. She'll never know. She'll never leave." I moved out that week. I moved to a different city entirely, changed my phone number, deleted all my social media. I've never lived in a duplex again. Never will. But sometimes late at night I still hear it. Top, top, top. 3 knocks. And I wonder if he's out there somewhere watching someone else. Waiting. Planning. And I wonder if they'll figure it out in time. I started working remotely in March 2024 when my company transitioned to a fully distributed model. As a software developer, the shift was seamless. I already spent most of my time in video calls, collaborating with team members across different time zones. The only real change was no longer commuting to an office. My setup was simple: a desk in my spare bedroom, 2 monitors, a decent webcam, and a microphone. I'd video call into daily stand-ups, sprint planning sessions, and one-on-ones with my manager. The rhythm became comfortable, predictable. My manager, David, was in his early 40s, based in Austin. He was professional, generally supportive, and maintained clear boundaries between work and personal life. We'd been working together for almost 2 years, though we'd only met in person once, at a company retreat before the pandemic. Our one-on-one meetings were scheduled every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific. We'd discuss ongoing projects, address blockers, review performance metrics. Standard stuff. The calls usually lasted 30 minutes, sometimes stretching to 45 if we had a lot to cover. On May 14, 2024, our Tuesday call started normally. David appeared on screen, his home office visible behind him with bookshelves and a window showing late morning light. He smiled, asked about my weekend, and we transitioned into work discussion. We were about 20 minutes into the call when I noticed something odd. David had stopped mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open, frozen in place. I thought my internet had dropped and the video feed had frozen. I checked my connection. Everything was fine. 5 bars. Excellent speed. I looked back at the screen. David was moving again, but something was wrong. His movements were too smooth, too fluid, like he was underwater, and his lips weren't syncing with the words I was hearing. There was a delay, maybe half a second, but enough to be noticeable. I mentioned it, asked if he was experiencing technical difficulties on his end. He paused, tilted his head slightly, and smiled. That smile, it was too wide, too sharp. Then he said everything was fine on his end. Maybe the issue was with my setup. We continued the meeting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. David's mannerisms were slightly different, more formal, less natural. When he laughed at one of my comments, it sounded hollow, practiced. The meeting ended at 10:47 a.m. David thanked me for my time, said he'd follow up via email, and ended the call. The screen went black, then returned to my desktop. I immediately opened Slack and messaged him. Just wanted to confirm we're aligned on the sprint priorities. His response came 3 minutes later. All good. Thanks for the productive call. I tried to forget about it. Technical glitches happened. Video compression could create weird artifacts. Delays in audio sync were common. But that night, while I was making dinner, I got a notification on my phone. David has invited you to a video call. I frowned. It was 7:32 p.m. We never did calls outside work hours. I answered. David appeared on screen, sitting in the same position as earlier, in the same clothes with the same background. He smiled that same too-wide smile and said he wanted to follow up on a few items from our morning discussion. I felt a prickle of unease but went along with it. We talked for about 10 minutes, covering topics we'd already covered that morning. His responses were identical, word for word, like he was reading from a script. I tested it by asking a question that hadn't come up earlier. He paused, stared at me for a long moment, then repeated one of his previous answers. I made an excuse and ended the call quickly. Something was very wrong. I opened my email and searched for David's messages. The most recent was from 3 days ago, a brief note about an upcoming deadline. Nothing from today. Nothing about following up. I messaged him on Slack again. Hey, did you just try to call me? No response. I waited 15 minutes. Still nothing. Then, at 8:03 p.m., my phone buzzed again. David has invited you to a video call. I didn't answer. The call rang for 2 full minutes, then disconnected. 3 minutes later, another invitation. I silenced my phone and tried to focus on something else. But over the next hour, the invitations kept coming. Every few minutes, another call attempt, each one lasting exactly 2 minutes before timing out. At 9:47 p.m., I finally answered out of frustration. I was ready to ask what was going on, demand an explanation. But when the call connected, David wasn't there. The video feed showed his office, empty, with his chair pushed back from the desk. The room was dark now, lit only by the glow of his computer monitor. I waited, watching the empty frame. Then, slowly, the chair began to roll forward. In, like someone invisible was sitting down. The chair stopped in front of the camera, and David appeared. But not in the way people normally appear on video calls. He faded in like a photograph developing until he was fully visible. He smiled, that same unsettling smile, and then he spoke, but his lips didn't move. The voice came through my speakers, clear and distinct. I've been trying to reach you. I ended the call immediately and blocked his number. I blocked his email. I blocked him on Slack. Then I messaged my skip-level manager, explaining I needed to speak urgently about a concerning situation with David. She responded quickly, asking if I was okay. I said I would be once we talked. She scheduled a call for first thing the following morning. I barely slept that night. Every notification on my phone made me jump. Every sound in my apartment made me freeze. The next morning at 8 a.m., I called my skip-level manager and explained everything. The frozen video, the too-wide smile, the identical repeated conversation, the calls that wouldn't stop. She listened quietly, asked clarifying questions, and then said something that made my blood run cold. David hasn't been with the company for 3 weeks. I felt the room tilt. She continued. He'd resigned suddenly in late April, citing personal health reasons. The transition had been quiet. They'd reassigned his reports to other managers. She'd assumed I'd been notified through the usual channels. Apparently, that message had never reached me. I asked who I'd been meeting with every Tuesday, who I'd been talking to in our one-on-ones. She said she'd look into it, but from her records, I hadn't had any scheduled meetings with anyone since David's departure. According to the calendar system, my Tuesday time slots were empty, but I had screenshots. I had Slack messages. I had call logs on my phone. I pulled them up to send as proof and my stomach dropped. The messages I'd sent to David were all marked as delivered but never read. The call logs showed outgoing calls to a number I didn't recognize. And the screenshots I'd taken showed my desktop with no video call window open. Just my empty screen and the timestamp. My skip-level manager suggested I take the day off and speak with HR. She said they'd investigate, but her tone suggested she thought I was confused, maybe burned out, maybe in need of a mental health break. I hung up and sat in silence for a long time. Then I did something I'd been avoiding. I searched for David's name online. LinkedIn, Facebook, any social media presence. What I found made everything worse. David's LinkedIn profile was still active, but his status had changed. It no longer listed our company. Instead, it showed a single line, currently unavailable. His profile photo had been replaced with a generic gray silhouette, and his last update, posted 3 weeks ago, was a single sentence. Sometimes the calls never really end. I shut my laptop and didn't open it for 2 days. I called in sick. I stopped checking Slack. I ignored emails. I needed space to process what was happening. But on the 3rd day, I received a package at my door. No return address. Just my name and address in printed labels. Inside was a USB drive. Nothing else. No note. No explanation. Against every instinct screaming at me not to, I plugged it into an old laptop I hadn't used in years, one not connected to any networks. The drive contained a single video file. I clicked play. The video showed David's office, the same view I'd seen dozens of times. But the camera angle was slightly different, positioned behind where David usually sat, facing outward toward where his webcam would be. The timestamp in the corner showed April 29th, 2024, 6:47 p.m. The room was dim, evening light fading through the window. David entered frame and sat down heavily in his chair. He looked exhausted, defeated. He stared at his monitor for a long moment, then reached forward and started typing. I couldn't see what he was typing, but after a few minutes, he leaned back and spoke to someone off camera. His voice was too quiet to make out words, but his tone was pleading, desperate. He gestured at the screen, pointed at himself, shook his head repeatedly. Then the camera shifted slightly, as if someone had bumped the tripod. And in that brief moment, I saw the reflection in David's monitor. There was nothing there, just an empty desk, no programs running, no video calls connected, just a black screen reflecting back his own exhausted face. David stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. He backed away from the desk, hands raised like he was trying to ward something off. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then he collapsed, falling out of frame. The video continued for another 3 minutes. The empty chair, the dim room, the fading light. Then, at 6:51 p.m., the chair rolled forward slowly until it was centered in frame. And David appeared again, sitting upright, staring directly at the camera. But his eyes were wrong. Empty. Hollow. He smiled that too wide smile and the video ended. I pulled the USB drive from the laptop and threw it away immediately. I contacted HR the next day and requested an immediate transfer to a different team, citing irreconcilable differences with my previous management structure. They approved it without questions. I never learned what happened to David. Not really. But sometimes late at night, when I'm working on my computer, I see my webcam light turn on for a split second. Just a brief flicker, then darkness again. And once, just once, I received a Slack message from an account with no name, no profile photo, just a blank gray circle. The message said, "The calls never really end, do they?" I changed jobs 3 months later. I disabled every camera in my apartment. I put tape over my laptop webcam. I never do video calls anymore unless absolutely necessary, and when I do, I end them the moment something feels off. Because I learned something important. Some connections, once made, are impossible to fully sever. Some calls continue long after you think you've hung up. And some faces on screens aren't the people they claim to be. They're echoes, fragments, things that learn to mimic us so well that even we can't tell the difference until it's too late.